It was hot enough to burn, and the air wasn't moving at all, but a thundercloud was keeping the patio shaded winter dark. On account of the strange feeling in the world, the customers out there weren't talking much. It was the kind of weather that my mom used to call ominous. She'd put up spare crosses to keep away bad spirits, and it made me and my brother feel better. We didn't have any relics at Cooper's though, because Cooper always said bargoers wouldn't like it. They didn't want to be reminded of religion while they were getting trashed and trying to get some. Made sense, sure. I still wished I had some sort of comfort as I took my day's first roundabout through the building. Cooper's had been active in his 20s as a speakeasy and had been expanded many times. Till now, it was a gigantic mess of a building. The trip to the bathrooms alone had newcomers confused. They'd go back from the bar area and find a little dining room, back some more and find a half-exposed patio, back past that and there's narrow steps down to a crappy basement drinking area. If they take a left past those stairs, they hit one of the building's exits. If they turn around, the bathroom doors are in the wall behind them, same color as the surrounding wood. They usually don't even know the doors are there unless someone else comes out. And that was just half the first floor. The place had 2 basement levels, 4 floors, and a small fenced area on the roof. It was a mansion of a bar, and Cooper treated it that way. He was there getting drunk and giving away free drinks every single night. He was his own personal party every day of the week. Us? We were just buzzkills at his party. Nobody wants to think about paying the help while the party's still on, but his party never ended, so he was always pissy and annoyed that he had to give money to these people in his mansion. There were random screaming fits and lots of excuses to dock pay, but that stuff was still better than my last job. No, the thing that got me was his need to test us. He'd leave some random mess somewhere in the mazy bar at the start of the day, and later he'd ask us if we did our roundabouts right. We'd say yes, of course, and he'd say, well then, let's check upstairs, and we'd know we were boned right from the start. He'd make a big speech on the way up these steps about trusting us and appreciating our help, and then, oh, what's this? I left this mess here to test you and it's not cleaned up. I thought you said you did your roundabout, right? And then it was half an hour of red-faced screaming while we stood in place with a dead expression. One frown, one tear, or one word would get you fired. We'd all seen it. So I was hot-faced when I found it. I didn't say anything because the quiet outside had snuck in somehow and kept everything in the building whispery and weird. I felt that Cooper would hear even the slightest mutter, so I just cleaned it up without a word. He didn't say anything that day though. He didn't ask about my roundabout. The weather was exactly the same the next day. A little hotter and quieter, if anything. Just really damn nervous weather, like some terrible storm's coming. He took orders in hushed tones and the customers spoke like they were in a church during a sermon. I found it again, in the same place. The 4th floor was smaller than the others, one big room really which topped the mansion, and it was usually only available for reserved events. A few too small windows showed out onto dark gray skies, making me feel uncomfortably visible to the unhappy air out there. The big room was otherwise usually pretty nice. There was nothing up there but brick walls, hardwood floors, a small bar in one corner, and a whole lot of tables and chairs. The chairs were all upside down on the tables like they were supposed to be, but somebody had built little houses out of the sugar packets in the middle of all that. I didn't know how the hell he'd done it the first time, and I sure didn't have any idea the second. To even get to the sugar packets, I had to carefully pull down a bunch of chairs at each table, and putting the chairs back on would surely have knocked down the little structures. It was as impressive as it was strange, and the whole silent time I was fixing it, I felt like he was looking over my shoulder from somewhere, but there was only a narrow, gray-skied window behind me. Just as I was done, something creaked somewhere, and I hurried out of there. Weird thing was, Cooper didn't say anything about my roundabout that day either. My next shift, it was still quiet and dark out, and painfully hot. That time he finally questioned my rounds, and I told him I'd found his little trick a third time and decided not to fix it. Not in so many words, of course. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, so I took him up to the 4th floor. I'd seen the little sugar packet buildings not 2 hours before, but now the big room was totally different. Chairs had been stacked into big regular pillars in the middle of the room, and the tables were all on their sides in hexagon shapes. Cooper was pissed, and he told me to clean it up or I wouldn't get paid for that day. I didn't know if that was legal, but I had no choice, really. Confused and angry, I spent an hour setting tables back up and upending chairs right. Who had even been up here? I'd just been in there 2 or 3 hours before, and I hadn't seen anyone have enough time to do all that. Just as I put the last chair up on one of the tables and wiped sweat away from my forehead, I felt like somebody was watching me again. This time I stared at the dark skies out one of the narrow windows, with the feeling that I would see somebody out there in the shifting clouds. Somebody who was watching me from really far away. The longer I stared, the more creeping little needles climbed up my spine, and I eventually had to break and run downstairs. When the 4th floor tables and chairs were rearranged again the next day, Cooper called me at home to bitch me out. All I could do was remind him that he'd seen me fix them and leave, and hadn't been back since. That shifted his anger towards someone else, a prankster that he swore he was going to catch. He only got angrier as it continued to happen every day for the next week. The patterns became more complex, and even the bottles for the corner bar up there started to get mixed in. At some point we went up there in the morning to find a single stack of beer bottles from the floor to the ceiling. One bottle on top of another, perfectly capped to bottom from hardwood to paint. I touched it and they all fell and smashed everywhere. Cooper docked my pay double for each one. What? For once, I shouted back at him, and he got really red-faced and talked low. He said that sure, he'd give me the money if I sat outside that room with him the entire night to catch the prankster. Whatever, I agreed. I was invested too. I couldn't figure out how the hell they were doing it. It was the hottest night that month, and the air was like a heavy wool blanket. It hadn't rained once in weeks, and breathing was like eating sandpaper. I was mad though, and I had a mission. I set 2 chairs in a tiny room near the base of the stairs to the 4th floor. The idea was that we'd wait for creaking on the steps and then rush outside to catch the guy. It made sense. The steps were the only way up. So, after finishing up all my closing tasks at around 4 in the morning, I turned off all the lights like usual and headed out the back, but then slipped around through the dark and let myself and Cooper in through one of the many side doors. We crept up to the 2nd floor, down a couple of hallways, took a right, and then used the old service ladder to get up to the 3rd. Finally, we snuck into our little room near the base of the steps to the 4th, and we holed up. Cooper had brought a 6-pack of bottles, but he didn't share. He simply sat in the dark, drinking and fuming. Even though I couldn't see him, I knew how red-faced he must have been. It was how he always got, and I imagined he might beat this poor trickster kid to death if we actually caught him. He was into his 2nd beer when the night sounds of the Maisie Mansion bar began settling in. A creak echoed from somewhere far away, and we both stiffened in our seat a little. But no, it was nothing. A fan kicked on somewhere for a minute. What fan? What did it do? I've never heard it before. It cycled off before I could really pinpoint it with my ears. Like we'd been hearing all month, thunder rumbled outside. The shift in pressure that came with it creaked and swayed the building in a way that I would never have felt during the day. It was only now that I could feel it, with no other sense or noise or sight to get in the way. The rolling thunder faded, and a floorboard creaked. Cooper sat up tall in the dark, and I heard the slight clink of his beer being put down. Taking the hint, I stood with him, going slow to avoid making noise. We both waited through another deep roll of trembling thunder, ears straining for any hint that someone was outside in the 3rd floor hallway. I focused my hearing out there, going deeper and deeper into the silence. Every moment, the feeling that I was about to hear something horrible grew stronger, until an incredible ruckus erupted above us, and we heard wood slamming wood and tables sliding. It sounded like an explosion, or like a trained troop of soldiers had suddenly all taken action at once. Together, Cooper and I burst out of our hiding spot and ran up. He furiously kicked open the door. All of the tables, chairs, and beer and liquor bottles had been arranged in scattered geometric patterns. There was no motion in the room. It had all been done almost instantly. That wasn't the part that shocked us, though. It was the fact that we could see it. The narrow windows still showed out onto the stormy gray skies. It was 5 in the morning and still pitch black out, but the windows were showing the same gray day storms I'd been seeing all month long. That and a light blue glow, like moss in a cave, was just finishing fading as we scanned the room. As the blue glow faded, so did the light from the windows, and darkness fell over us. Cooper swore, more fearful than angry now, and we both hustled downstairs and out of the building. Once we were out in the parking lot, he swore a dozen more times, and held a hand to his forehead while he tried to think about what to do. Haunted, he said. Shoulda known, he said. Shit, he said. He walked around breathing hard and cussing and throwing out ideas. He could sell the place, but he'd get sued if they found out he'd known about the haunting. He could try to find a priest or something, but he didn't want news to get out and scare customers away. Finally, he turned to me, and he said he had it. Instead of coming into work, I would go to the library and research the place's past or something. Do like an investigation, like in the movies. I was not having it. He said he'd dock my pay again. I threatened to quit rather than deal with a goddamn ghost. He stood a little taller. He said he'd sue me for stealing things if I didn't do it. I hadn't stolen anything, but he and I both knew that didn't matter. So pissed as hell, I went to the library the next day instead of the bar. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew in movies they always went to old newspaper articles, so I did that. The place had a terrible history, but wasn't that gonna be the case for a building over 100 years old? Someone had gotten shot there during Prohibition, a guy had died of a heart attack in the 30s, someone else had fallen off the little roof area in the 40s, before they'd had fences up there. And there was a lot of cases of workers going missing after complaining about working conditions and managerial theft. The last one concerned me. I'd always put up with Cooper's crap, but others hadn't. His family had owned the place since the beginning, and I'd heard stories of his grandfather's rather harsh take on his servants. His dad, too, had been a hard ass. I guess Cooper was just part of a family line of assholes who thought they'd owned you because you worked for them. And what was I doing? Running around like his personal assistant for Jack All? He didn't even pay me. The more I made in tips, the less the establishment had to pay me in wages by law. For the last 2 years, while he had a complete turnover in staff, every 3 months, I'd stuck around. For that, I'd gotten a paycheck of $0.00 twice a month. And if the orders got messed up, if customers changed their minds, or if I got something wrong, it came out of my pay. I was basically paying this bastard to work at his bar. Meanwhile, he partied it up every night, acting like the world's biggest hero. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. And not just for me. A century of people like me had made the Cooper family rich. It was no wonder his damn place was haunted. Somebody up there was clamoring for attention. Cooper kept me on secret figuring out the ghost duty for the next few weeks, as the heat and quiet deepened into the flapjack's face-down side to hell itself. Everyone else sweated and cooked in their seats, but I kept inside, studying the 4th floor. The pattern began to make sense. There was a timing to it, and a strong connection to the weather. The effect, too, was getting more elaborate. It was all the murmur that had begun with sugar packets and now turned into shouting with splintered wood. That last day, the tables themselves had been disassembled and carved into something new. Shapes that vaguely resembled bones, with intricate random patterns carved upon them. I picked up one of the 5-foot-long carvings and stared at it for a good hour, trying to figure out what these tormented spirits were asking for. The walls were wet, and I realized that the liquid from inside the still-sealed liquor bottles had been splattered into spirals, circles, and lines. Annoyed at what would end up being yet another dock in my pay, I moved the remaining tables, chairs, and bottles out of the room, and then spent 2 hours scrubbing the walls dry. That last day, the weather had become oppressive to the point of torture. The air was thick and hard to breathe, and the sky was pitch black at noon. The thick thunderclouds that had been gathering for the entire summer sat overhead like 100 fists waiting to punch someone in the face. People were scared, but in a muted kind of way they couldn't share. Attendance was up, but only so customers could drink themselves into oblivion, and then the dishwashing machine broke. Cooper came in and announced the staff would all be staying late to wash dishes by hand, unpaid of course. I heard this and pulled him aside. See, I didn't really think anything bad would happen, but I did want to scare some human decency into him. I knew the high upper room would be doing its thing in about 2 minutes, so I told him I'd solve the problem. In fact, and this is the bit of genius I made up on the spot, something else weird had started happening. The wooden tables and chairs, instead of being rearranged, had started turning into gold. His eyes lit up something devilish, but he slapped me on the back and told me he'd give me a 10-cent raise if it were true. For my hard work that summer, he said, and because, god damn it, he just liked me as a person. As long as I wasn't kidding him about this gold thing, of course. Thanking him profusely, I walked him up, smiled at him at the top of the 4th-floor stairs, and let him go first. I closed the door behind him and hurried down to the kitchen to wait among my co-workers. It didn't take long. Cooper's blood-curdling scream echoed out through his mazy mansion bar, loud enough to be heard by customers and staff alike. None of us moved. At that moment, the 2-month-long build-up finally broke. A tremendous blast of thunder shook the building, and rain started blasting down with torrential force outside. A longtime regular customer stood up, his eyes concerned, and one of our bartenders finally started moving. We followed our impromptu leader up their first flight of stairs, still hearing Cooper scream sporadically through the rain and thunder. Silence fell halfway up the 2nd flight, and we crept along the dim 3rd floor with a sense of dread. I was worried too, because I'd only meant to scare him, and these screams had been far deeper than fear. We stepped up the last set of stairs, one creaking board at a time, and all hesitated outside the door. No sound came from inside, at least none that we could hear over the gusting rain. Thunder shook the building again, scaring us forward. Our bartender leader took the handle, turned it, and swung open as we all stared into a room lit by gray skies that floated gloomily past narrow windows. There was no sign of the storm through that glass, and the usual eerie blue glow was already fading, but we got a good look. I should have expected it, really. I'd taken out all the carved wood and remaining chairs and tables. I'd even removed the bottles and liquor from the bar. The pattern was quite beautiful in a way. It was the most complex yet, and it spanned the room in a dazzling display of hanging, dripping, and stacked geometry. The carven shapes had become extremely intricate, and the splatters on the wall had taken on a new level of artistry. The materials were the only reason anyone started screaming. Since I'd removed everything else, the only thing left in the room to rearrange by the phenomenon had been Cooper himself.